event. Today's Transatlantic Currents webinar, entitled The U.S. Nuclear Posture Review and its Implications for European Security. This event is brought to you by the Center on U.S. Politics and Power here at the Finnish Institute of International Affairs in Helsinki. My name is Ville Sinkkonen. I'm a postdoctoral fellow here at the center. Today's event could not be any more timely. Questions of potential nuclear escalation and nuclear deterrence have been top of mind in the transatlantic space and globally ever since Russia launched the current phase of its war of aggression in Ukraine on the 24th of February. Of course, the immediate impetus for the discussion is the Biden administration's release of its key strategy documents, namely the National Security Strategy, the National Defense Strategy, the Missile Defense Review, and the Nuclear Posture Review, the focus of today's conversation. Now, a few housekeeping things. To facilitate a fruitful discussion, I ask you to first off keep your cameras and mics turned off during the event. You can type your questions in the chat, and you can start doing so already during the speaker's presentation. And we'll try to get as many of your questions as we can during the event. And now, without further ado, I'll leave you in the hands of my colleague, our own non-resident fellow, Leo Michel. And Leo is himself, of course, a top expert on nuclear issues. And Leo will introduce our speakers for the day, and he will lead the discussion. Over to you, Leo.
Thanks very much, Ville, and hello from Washington, D.C. Over the past several years, through its research, publications, conferences, and this podcast series, FIA has endeavored to enhance public understanding of deterrence, the role of nuclear weapons, non-proliferation, and arms control issues. And as Ville mentioned, the Russian attack on Ukraine, the thinly veiled nuclear saber rattling by Russian leaders at the highest level, the decisions by Finland and Sweden to apply for membership in NATO, a self-declared nuclear alliance, and important developments beyond the Euro-Atlantic region have focused even greater interest in these topics. Of course, for many decades, US nuclear forces have played a vital role in deterring strategic attack against the United States, its allies, and its partners. Since 1994, every president has submitted to Congress a wide-ranging review prepared by the Department of Defense of the administration's nuclear strategy, its policies, the nuclear posture, and programs to keep the nuclear deterrent safe, reliable, and credible. The Biden administration sent its nuclear posture review to Congress in a classified form last March and released an unclassified version just 3 weeks ago. So to help us understand the key findings of this review and the direction it sets for the future of the US nuclear deterrent, I'm pleased to welcome Frank Klotz and Alexandra Evans. Frank Klotz is an adjunct senior fellow at the RAND Corporation, and he served as Undersecretary of Energy for Nuclear Security and Administrator of the National Nuclear Security Administration during 2014 to 2018. He is a retired US Air Force Lieutenant General with extensive high-level experience involving strategic affairs, including as Commander, Air Force Global Strike Command. And that command is responsible for the nation's 3 intercontinental ballistic missile wings, the Air Force's entire bomber force, and nuclear command, control, and communication systems. We'll also hear from Alexandra Evans, who is an important policy researcher at the RAND Corporation, and she specializes in strategic competition, deterrence and coercion, escalation management, and regional security issues regarding Europe and the Middle East. We'll begin with about 10 minutes of opening remarks from each speaker. I've asked Frank Klotz to give us an overview of the NPR, its purpose, its key issues and decisions, and perhaps identifies some of the unresolved questions that will need to be addressed in the coming months and years. Alexandra Evans will look more deeply into the NPR's effect on the current U.S. nuclear modernization program, which was the subject of the RAND report that she co-authored with Frank, and which was linked to the invitation to this webinar. I'll then ask a couple of follow-up questions before turning the session back to Villa, who will moderate your questions posed through the chat function. Frank, let me turn it over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Leo. It's for that very, very kind introduction. It's both an honor and a pleasure to participate in this webinar, and I appreciate you having invited me and to do so. I'm also delighted to be joined by my RAND colleague and co-author on a recent RAND report that you mentioned on U.S. nuclear modernization, Dr. Alexandra Evans, for this presentation. Now, as Leo said, he's asked Alex and me to each make about 10 minutes of opening remarks. I realize, of course, that the most useful and interesting feature of an event like this is usually the give and take in the Q&A session that follows. So I'll try to be brief. I'd like to start by providing some background information on the Nuclear Posture Review and its role in U.S. national security policy process. I'll then focus on a few key points found within the 2022 NPR, stressing the remarkable degree of continuity between this NPR and the NPRs produced by previous presidential administrations, both Democrat and Republican. Finally, I'll turn the mic over to Alex for a discussion of the NPR specific guidance on the composition of the U.S. nuclear deterrent force, as well as the ongoing programs to modernize that force and its supporting infrastructure. But first, some background on the NPR. Every presidential administration since the mid-1990s has produced a nuclear posture review, as Leo mentioned, usually within the first 1 or 2 years in office. The 2022 NPR thus represents the fifth in a series of such reviews. The main purpose of the NPR, both past and present, is to describe U.S. nuclear strategy, policy, posture, and forces, as well as the complementary role that arms control and non-proliferation and nuclear counterterrorism can potentially play in reducing nuclear risks. Now, even with the NPR in existence, there's still a large family of documents prepared each year at multiple levels within the U.S. national security enterprise, mostly classified, that define and give greater substance to American nuclear policy, force structure, the size of the weapons stockpile, and employment policy. That said, the NPR can be and has been a very useful vehicle for presidential administrations to define and to articulate in a single document their basic nuclear deterrence and arms control policies, and to describe the types and numbers of nuclear capabilities they believe that the nation needs. In previous administrations, the NPR was released as a standalone document. Though I should add, truth in advertising, the NPR was usually drafted while other major reviews of U.S. national security strategy were also underway, and by many of the same officials involved in those reviews. But for this NPR, for this year, Biden administration officials take great pride in claiming, rightfully, that the 2002 NPR represents the first time that it, along with the Missile Defense Review, has been included in the broader U.S. national defense strategy, which conceptually makes a great deal of sense. And knowing from personal experience how difficult it can be to gain closure on deliberations within the U.S. interagency process on practically any topic, much less nuclear policy, those officials are certainly justified in being pleased that they succeeded in simultaneously releasing all three reviews in a single document. Finally, it's worth noting that the NPR is by no means the final word on what nuclear forces the United States will ultimately possess. Many of you have perhaps heard the phrase that in the American political system, the president proposes and the Congress disposes. The funds required to develop, operate, and maintain every single weapon system in the US military must in fact be authorized and appropriated by Congress, and on an annually recurring basis, which allows the Congress to revisit every decision it has made every year one more time. In the process, Congress can and Congress has added to, subtracted from, and even zeroed out various weapon programs that presidents have recommended. So for those who wish to fully understand US nuclear policy, it is important to not only be familiar with the substance of the NPR, but to also follow the ebb and flow of the congressional budget process as it deals with US nuclear policy and forces. So what does the 2022 NPR actually say? Well, with that as background, let me try and talk a little bit about the contents. I do so with the caveat that time does not permit us to do justice to the entire document. So I'll only comment on 2 or 3 points within the NPR, ones that have drawn perhaps the most attention in the public commentary that has followed its publication at the end of last month. As I noted at the outset, one of the most remarkable things about the 2022 NPR is how consistent it is with past NPRs. One might think that with the recent dramatic and in some cases horrific changes we've witnessed in the international landscape over the past few years, that the current NPR would be very different in both content and tone than its predecessors. And indeed, the 2022 NPR and the larger US national defense strategy does devote considerable attention to developments regarding China, a problem it defines as acute, as chronic, as well as Russia, a problem it defines as acute. But the basic tenets of American nuclear policy, as described in the NPR, remain largely the same as before. For example, the 2022 NPR reaffirms, and I quote, "As long as nuclear weapons exist, the fundamental role," let me say that phrase again, "the fundamental role of nuclear weapons is to deter nuclear attack upon the United States, our allies, and our partners," end of quote. This language is very, very close to the words that President Obama used in his 2008 Prague speech, and that was used in both the 2010 and the 2018 NPRs. But I should add that there is an important backstory here that is worth telling regarding the phrase, "the fundamental role of nuclear weapons." In the latter days of the Obama administration, and in the run-up to the 2020 presidential election, several arms control NGOs had called for the US government to declare that the sole purpose of US nuclear weapons was to deter nuclear attack, and that the United States should rely upon non-nuclear capabilities to deter conventional attacks, cyber attacks, and attacks involving other types of weapons of mass destruction. Interestingly, Biden, as both vice president and as a candidate for president, had expressed sympathy for this sole purpose formulation. In a related vein, other arms control advocates had also urged the United States government to publicly adopt a no first use policy with respect to nuclear weapons as part of its pledge to reduce the role of nuclear weapons in US foreign policy. Well, the NPR rejects both of these notions, stating that the administration officials had conducted a thorough review of a broad range of options for nuclear declaratory policy and had carefully solicited the views of allies and partners. The NPR concluded in the end that those approaches, sole purpose, no first use, would result in an unacceptable level of risk in light of the range of non-nuclear capabilities that could inflict significant strategic level damage to the United States and its allies and partners. Well, in a bid perhaps to soften the blow felt by some in the arms control community, the NPR goes on to say that the United States maintains a very high bar for employment of nuclear weapons, and that it would only consider the use of nuclear weapons in extreme circumstances to defend the vital interests of the United States or its allies and partners. In another example of continuity, the 2022 NPR also reaffirms that the United States remains committed to maintaining a safe, secure, and effective nuclear deterrent, including a triad of long-range nuclear delivery systems, as well as theater-capable and dual-capable fighter aircraft. Now, at first blush, this statement may also seem unremarkable. But as Alex will soon discuss in greater detail, several arms control advocates and a few members of Congress have criticized various aspects of the U.S. programs to modernize all three legs of its nuclear triad. Some critics have even argued that the existing force of 400 U.S. land-based intercontinental ballistic missiles, or ICBMs, should not be replaced as planned, while others have called for the ICBM force to be significantly reduced in size or eliminated altogether. The NPR also rejects this notion. As in previous NPRs, even I will say the Trump administration's 2018 NPR, the 2022 NPR also addresses how arms control, risk reduction, and nuclear non-proliferation can complement deterrence in a multifaceted strategy to reduce nuclear dangers of all kinds. That said, Biden administration officials also clearly recognize the considerable challenges facing the arms control process in the current international political environment, as well as changes within the makeup and structure of both Russian and Chinese nuclear capabilities. Biden administration officials are nevertheless determined to continue pursuing various approaches and negotiating venues to reduce nuclear dangers, while also preparing to resume arms control diplomacy with Russia and to begin dialogue with China on nuclear issues when conditions permit and the time is right. With that, I think I'd like to hand the mic over to Dr. Evans for her part of the presentation, and I'll say a little bit at the end of that. So Alex, over to you.
Thanks, Frank, and thank you to our hosts for gathering all of us here together. You know, our conversations about whether to hold this event began earlier, but I think this last week has really underscored the importance of promoting understanding about the current status of U.S. nuclear weapons policy and its future trajectory, and that this is not an issue that just affects the United States alone. So I'm going to be brief here. I'm really quite eager to hear the perspectives of others on the line. But I think, you know, in the context of the continuity that Frank outlined, I think it's important to take a step back to understand sort of the origins of the modernization programs of record that are currently underway in the United States. And despite all of the discussion of changes in the Chinese nuclear inventory, the challenges the United States faces as it contemplates operating in a world in which it now confronts two major nuclear rivals, the current modernization program was really set into motion during the Obama administration in 2010, at a time where the scale and the pace of Chinese modernization was not anticipated. And the impetus at that time was really to understand how to sustain the U.S. abilities in the space to be able to meet future requirements at a point that its systems were, to put it bluntly, beginning to get quite old. The United States had repeatedly, since the end of the Cold War, deferred decisions about modernization, choosing instead to live off earlier investments and to extend the service life of existing capabilities, rather than to take on the cost of designing, developing, and deploying new systems, particularly new delivery systems. And as a result, the last time the U.S. had procured any nuclear-capable missile or bombers was in 1997. But in 2010, and it was not the first administration to bring up this question, but it was the first to sort of begin to move forward, the Obama administration directed the Navy to begin a technology development process to replace its Ohio-class submarines, instructed the Air Force to begin a formal assessment of alternatives. This is the process to determine whether and how to replace any system, but in this case, the nuclear-capable air-launched cruise missile, and instructed the DoD to begin an initial study of possible alternatives to its ICBMs, which were the Minuteman III, or I should say are. This effort then gained steam after, or rather during the debate over ratification of New START, where the Obama administration struck what's been described as a grand bargain, in which it agreed to certify its intent to modernize and replace the triad in exchange for ratification. And there was subsequent legislation that then required the president to continuously, annually, to commit to this modernization and replacement. And despite some changes in rhetoric and some changes in the international environment, the Trump administration worked largely within that framework. Beginning during the later stages of the Obama administration and continuing through Trump, the Navy, which had already pushed back the retirement of its Ohio-class submarines, has moved ahead with a new Columbia-class. These are expected to be delivered in 2028, and then they're going to conduct their first deterrent patrol in 2031. The Navy then plans to also continue using its Trident II D5 submarine-launched ballistic missiles, SLBMs, which were just life extended, but they are also pursuing a second phase life extension program to ensure the reliability of these systems. And then the Air Force, in the meanwhile, is upgrading its subsystems of the B-52 bomber, H bomber, which rolled off production lines in 1962. So they really are an example of the age of these systems, but their continued relevance. And it's developing at the same time a new generation stealth bomber, which reportedly will both have a nuclear and conventional role. It's sort of illustration of those dual dynamics that Frank alluded to. Because of some sustainment issues with its current air-launched cruise missile, it also gained approval in 2016 and has been continuing to make progress on development of a long-range standoff weapon known as the LRSO, while again extending the service life of its existing warhead to ensure operations during that transition period. And then there is sort of the most controversial, perhaps, of this is the effort to replace the Minuteman III ICBMs with a new system. It previously was known as the Ground-Based Strategic Deterrent, or GBSD, which is really quite a mouthful, and has since been designated Sentinel. And this appears to be on track to reach initial operational capability in 2029 and full capability in the following decade. Though, of course, as Frank alluded to, there are outstanding questions that will have to be following to make sure supply chain disruptions and other questions ensure delivery on time. But even before the NPR was released, the expectation has been that the Biden administration was going to stay the course and maintain these existing programs. And in fact, as Frank alluded to, that's exactly what we see. It has been recommended in the NPR. But in addition to replacing each of these components of the delivery side, it's also in recent weeks really stressed the importance of other overlooked programs that are to ensure the overall nuclear enterprise remains healthy. This includes efforts to sustain existing systems during that transition period, which is going to last into the 2030s, to make sure that the U.S. is still able to respond to any challenges during that period. And this is equally important, but sometimes overlooked, to modernize the command, control, and communication systems, the national laboratories, and the production and support infrastructure upon which this whole enterprise relies. And that's both a technical challenge. There are elements of sort of modernization and innovation that are occurring within those spaces, but it also means retaining and training a generation of human capital, making sure that we have the manpower to keep supply chains operating, to make sure these production lines are working, and to develop and to deploy these systems to maintain them appropriately. And that has been highlighted because we are facing a transition from a period in which nuclear weapons were not at the fore of U.S. policy to a point in which there's a need to sort of address some generational challenges. Now, all that's a lot of continuity. There is one change, again, not necessarily a surprise, but one that has kicked up a bit of controversy, which is that the administration did announce that it was going to recommend scrapping one program, the nuclear-armed sea-launched cruise missile, SLICM-N, which the Trump administration had introduced in part to, it claimed that there was a need to have greater options to deter limited nuclear use, and the idea that this might be particularly useful in Asia to address some posturing questions. The Department of Defense has since determined it is not necessary, in part because it has a variety of other delivery platforms and lower yield options to deter limited nuclear use, and therefore it was not, the cost of this program was not needed. And part of that also is that because it's chosen to retain another somewhat, although not lately, controversial program, the W76-2-2 warhead, which is a lower yield version of the W76 that's used for submarine launched ballistic missiles. So with a range of options, it maintains there's enough flexibility in the system. And this has been a long sort of overview here, but I think it's important to emphasize that the United States is replacing fielded systems. It is not, as Russia and China are doing, attempting to expand and diversify its nuclear capabilities to include novel strategic systems. So unlike Russia, for example, the United States is not moving forward with efforts to mount a nuclear warhead on a hypersonic glide vehicle, for instance. That these are continuations of a position it has maintained in the past. Now, despite this continuity, this administration has disappointed some progressive elements of its own party, as well as lawmakers across the aisle that are concerned about the cost of the program. There's a vocal, although still small, contingent that have raised questions about the need to move forward with modernization. And they're particularly emphasized on the new ICBM, the Sentinel, as well as the SLICM, which was proposed to be canceled. And I'm happy to go into sort of the details of this debate if there's interest. But generally, the four questions can be distilled down to, does the United States need to maintain a triad? Could it achieve its aims at perhaps at less cost by focusing on the air and sea-based legs? Are ICBMs sort of related to this net stabilizing or destabilizing? Do they introduce unique risks about accidental launch or sort of crisis dynamics and therefore aren't necessary? And then looking to sort of the technical challenges, does the United States need to develop a new delivery system, or can it continue the course of the last several decades in which it incrementally extends the service life, upgrades specific subcomponents? And then even if that's not 100% able to meet future requirements in the way that the administration has suggested is necessary, are these upgrades in the end worth the cost? And so this is really where the focus has turned because we are seeing that the bill is due because of the way that these investments are sequenced. The costs are going to be particularly heavy over the next several years. So overall, though, the Biden administration, like its predecessors, maintains that the era of life extension is over. Fielding new systems is necessary. Any alternative, sort of the window of opportunity for that has long passed. And in fact, investing in new systems is going to produce cost savings over the life of these new systems, and that they will have longer service lives. And despite the recent midterm elections, I think we should expect to see broad bipartisan support for this modernization. There's actually some pressure in the opposite direction, in that members of the House and Senate Armed Services Committee have suggested they may attempt to keep funding for the SLICM-N, that canceled program, in defense authorization legislation to sort of force the administration to continue research and development in hopes that a later administration may choose to build the program. The White House has acknowledged this. Ultimately, they have voiced opposition, but also implied they would not veto, partially because the amount of money entailed, I think, probably falls into this calculation. In the context of the budget, it's not very much. But we will see what this looks like over the next few weeks. The Congress is currently crafting the National Defense Authorization Act. Hopefully, we will see that before the end of the calendar year. Key lawmakers have suggested they're still moving forward. And although this doesn't determine the overall amount, it is what sets the conditions of how the Department of Defense can spend its money. So with that, I'm going to turn it back to Frank for some closing comments. Frank, I believe you might be still muted.
As I was saying at the outset, after 2 years of COVID, you would think we would have mute buttons down cold, but apparently not. I apologize. At the outset, we observed that the 2022 NPR was remarkably consistent with its predecessors, despite the dramatic changes in strategic landscape that we've talked about. In fact, these changes may be a primary reason for that very consistency which we've observed. The basic tenets of U.S. nuclear policy were forged in an era in which major military conflict in Europe and East Asia was considered to be a very real possibility. Nuclear deterrence and extended deterrence and the declaratory policies and military capabilities required to give them effect were consciously designed to significantly reduce the risk of war by raising the prospect that any conflict involving the United States or its allies, however small at the outset, might deliberately or perhaps even inadvertently escalate out of control, perhaps even to the nuclear level, thus giving pause to anyone who might contemplate even starting down that path in the first place. The bellicose and unprovoked behavior by some nations that we've so recently observed have reinforced the continued saliency of nuclear deterrence as a foundational element of U.S. And alliance defense strategy. The arguments to change nuclear policy in fundamental ways or to substantially alter the existing U.S. nuclear force posture under the current conditions have, as a result, rightly been set aside in this NPR. So with that, Leo, we are prepared to address any questions you or members of FIA may have for the two of us.
Thank you very much, Frank, Alex. Let me just, I want to save time. I see that questions are already coming in from the audience chat. So let me ask just a couple of questions, and let me pose these at the outset, and then the two of you can decide who would like to respond. As you've pointed out, Frank, the NPR, like the National Defense Strategy, and in your remarks, there are frequent references to the importance of deterring attack against U.S. allies and partners, and as well reassuring those allies and partners that the U.S. is both willing and able to do so. The document, the NPR, also calls for the broadest possible participation by the allies in NATO's nuclear burden sharing arrangements. What does extended deterrence really mean to American strategists? Why is it so important to U.S. national security? And why are European contributions so important to Washington? And let me just tack on to that. Given your experience, given your assessments and analysis, what sorts of things should Finnish officials be thinking about to prepare themselves for their eventual membership in NATO's nuclear planning group, which acts as the senior body on nuclear matters in the alliance? That's a mouthful, one question. The second, a little bit more specific. Perhaps Alex would like to take this on. What is the expected price tag for the currently planned U.S. modernization program? If you were to look over, let's say, the next decade or so, as these systems are moved from prototypes into actual deployed systems.
Thank you, Leo. I'll start with a brief discussion of extended deterrence, and then talk more specifically about the consultative process and the burden sharing process within NATO. On extended deterrence, first of all, it's worth observing how many times the NPR uses the phrase allies and partners and the word consultation I have not gone through like a good empirically trained political scientist and done a content analysis of that document compared to previous documents, but my general sense is that there was great stress placed on the role and the importance of working together as an alliance, both in the European context, but also in the Asia Pacific, what we call the Indo-Pacific context as well. So that's the first point. On extended deterrence, I'm going to express a personal view based on 30, 40 years of doing this type of work. We sometimes, many observers, particularly those outside the strategic community, tend to think in terms of extended deterrence as the question of whether the United States would use nuclear weapons in another region in order to defend its allies. I don't think that's the question, and I don't think that's the way extended deterrence works. In my view, the way the extended deterrence works is the United States is an ally in the European context and in the Asian context, which has provided very capable and very sophisticated conventional and non-conventional forces to, in some cases, forward deployed, but certainly to exercise with, work with, train, develop doctrine with allies. And the point but most importantly, the United States, as well as the French and the British, are nuclear armed allies. So if there ever is a conflict in a European context or in an Asian context, in which those U.S. forces, along with their allied forces, get involved in a conventional, or the risk of getting involved in a conventional war, any potential adversary recognizes they are taking on an alliance in which one of the members, or two or more of the members, have a nuclear weapons capability. And that were that adversary to proceed down a path of major offensive operations, or even use a small number of nuclear weapons, they always have to calculate that they're doing that against an alliance that includes a member who has nuclear weapons and might be prepared to use those nuclear weapons to defend both its own country, but as well as allies. So I think that we need to, again, get away from, thinking about the use of nuclear weapons as part of an extended deterrence after extended deterrence, maybe to one extent, has failed in the sense that the adversary has launched a major war or conducted a nuclear attack, and think about what it means up front in the context of crises. If you go back, and I apologize for going on, but if you go back and look at some of the crises, some of the conflicts that have taken place in a European setting, or even for that matter in an Asian setting, since the dawn of the nuclear age, you will find the nuclear powers being extraordinarily circumspect and avoiding, when it comes to their nuclear armed competitors, and avoiding at all costs, it seems, not at all costs, but certainly very scrupulously avoiding the possibility that its forces would come into contact with the forces of the adversary. That's how I think deterrence and extended deterrence and conventional deterrence and nuclear deterrence reduce the risk of nuclear war by working on the decision calculus of adversaries that it's best just not to get started in the first place. So that's a rather long answer for that. I think on the question of nuclear burden sharing and the NPG, I served at NATO headquarters as the U.S. representative for the NPG staff group for 2 years. However, my knowledge is dated. Things change and improve. But let me just say this: every alliance member is a member of the nuclear planning group, which, as you rightly pointed out, Leo, is the While the North Atlantic Council is the ultimate decision authority within the context of NATO, the Nuclear Planning Group is the principal body which addresses nuclear policy to include force levels, to include doctrine, to include arms control associated with that. Every member of the alliance sits on the NPG, with the exception of France, which for reasons we could go into in a longer discussion has chosen not to be a part of the NPG. My own sense is, and the advice I would give to new members, or any member for that matter, is this is an important body. It is the opportunity for every alliance member to be involved in the process of helping set, determine, debate, and consult on alliance nuclear policy. And NATO has, after all, said, as long as nuclear weapons exist, the alliance will be a nuclear alliance. So it is the forum in which that takes place. When I was there, there were nations which participated actively and productively and valuably in the discussions in the NPG that were not involved in any of the traditional burden sharing activities within NATO. Their contribution, nevertheless, was extraordinarily important. And moreover, I noticed that a lot of countries who didn't have active burden sharing functions in that really sent extraordinarily good people, good diplomats, fast rising military officers to participate in that process. So, one of the pieces of advice I would have is to send your very best strategists and thinkers to Brussels to participate in the work of the NPG, the high-level group, which is an offshoot of the or a subset of the NPG, as well as the NPG staff group. And at the end of the day, NATO itself, personal view is NATO itself is not going to bring any pressure to bear on any member nation to take any actions that member nation does not want to take. And even if there are actions that nation would like to take in terms of potential roles with respect to nuclear burden sharing, that still has to be vetted by all the other nations through the NPG. And as you know, that can be a long process. And NATO operates under consensus, and therefore, and which I think is a good thing. It leads to good discussion, good debate. And I think at the end of the day, good outcomes.
Great. Well, I'll turn then to the budget question. You're throwing a question of numbers to a historian. How you calculate the cost of modernization, this is a source of substantial debate within Congress, within the advocacy community, and more broadly. The numbers I tend to rely on are those that come out of the Congressional Budget Office, CBO, which we're still waiting for an update. So with a note of sort of caution here, but estimate between 2021 and 2030, the overall cost is about $630 billion, I think 634. That includes current forces and modernization. That includes funds that are spent by the Department of Defense, but also those by the Department of Energy. And that overall cost somewhat obscures the distribution of expenses. So really the bulk of it is projected to have to be spent by 2028, because that's sort of the period of production ramping up. And so you're feeling a lot of the costs really now through 2028. I'm hesitant to begin to attempt to project beyond 2030 for the overall life of these systems, although I know that there are many that have, partially because we are at a extraordinary moment in the international economy. We really don't, there are the possibility for disruptions that will be discovered, or changes in underlying costs that will be discovered as we begin to get production lines that have been coaled up, as the US begins to work through questions about how to keep some of these production lines warm, as we deal with manpower questions, and as we deal with supply chain disruptions that affect sort of all sectors, not just this area. So there is a degree of uncertainty. So far, there's been assurances that the key things will move along on schedule, but it's something to monitor, and that does lead to cost changes. All of that said, I think it might also be helpful to explain the rationale or the cost rationale for modernization as it's been articulated under the Obama, Trump, and now Biden administrations as well, which have conducted internal reviews and generally reached the same conclusions. So we take the example of Sentinel, the new ICBM, as an illustration. The new design, based off sort of the public descriptions of it, is intended to be more modular, and also that the government will be able to control some of the sort of technology itself. And this has important cost implications because unlike the old system, there's the possibility of repairing, maintaining individual components more cheaply because they can be swapped out, of upgrading them more cheaply when necessary. This has led to sort of a suggestion that these systems might be more flexible and can be adapted to future threats more easily, but also lower cost. But that also that there's going to be a different bid process in some ways because they'll be able to compete more effectively for different firms to be part of that process. So overall, the expectation is life savings, but we still have to pay a pretty hefty check now.
Vila, over to you to introduce the questions.
Thank you very much. What an enlightening discussion. There's a few questions in the chat. The first one was kind of answered, but maybe we could go a bit more deeply into it. So the question reads something along the lines of, what do you think was the core reason why the funding for the development of the nuclear-armed submarine-launched cruise missile was scrapped? You mentioned some of them, but perhaps to kind of also look at the political side of it would be interesting. Then a related question, I'll throw three of the questions out in the open, and then you can choose which one you want to address. Another question ties into whether the Biden administration would be open to funding the development of new non-treaty bound nuclear weapons. That you also touched upon, but perhaps to address more why or why not, and under what kinds of contingencies that might actually happen. And then a final question tied into the Finnish debate that we're currently having. Of course, Finland is acquiring the F-35 multi-role fighters. So what role do you foresee for Finland in NATO's nuclear deterrence? And could this entail, for instance, Finnish involvement in snowcat missions to support nuclear missions in time of war? So those three questions we have currently from the chat. And I'll let you pick and choose which ones you want to address, Alexandra and Frank, please.
Well, let me start with the F-35 question, because my answer will be relatively brief for reasons you'll see. First of all, congratulations on the acquisition of the F-35. It is a tremendous capability. Now, let me say right up front, I'm an airman by birth, by upbringing, and by training for nearly 40 years in the Air Force. So I'm admittedly biased on this. I'm just struck, there has been a lot of press in the United States, adverse press in the United States about, developmental issues with the F-35 and GAO reports. I'm reminded that when I was a lieutenant colonel in the Air Staff, maybe even younger, there were the same kinds of stories about the C-17 transport. And how this airplane was the poster child of how not to build an airplane. We weathered that storm, and it turned out it is the most marvelous transport aircraft I think that's ever been developed. Nations all across the world want to have C-17s and do buy them. And I think it's going to be the same. It's the same case with the F-35. It's a tremendous capability. And oh, by the way, there are great advantages for any ally or any nation that buys into a program like the F-35, very much like buying into the F-16s earlier, where you have a large base of customers, and therefore great incentives to maintain a healthy and robust supply chain for spare parts and upgrade parts. And the cost of those maintaining that supply chain for spare parts and upgrade parts gets distributed across many different companies and countries. So that's tremendous. Now, in terms of what Finland should do, I'm going to defer on that. That is a decision, quite frankly, which the Finnish people, the Finnish government, in consultation with NATO leadership, as well as the other members of the NATO alliance, need to take. They ought to be, initially anyway, they ought to be, closely held discussions. Nothing's decided until everything's decided, and so I would not, in any way suggest that I'm smart enough or have enough insight into Finnish domestic politics or international politics to get involved in that discussion at all. That really is a sovereign question which the Finns need to decide on their own. I will say, based on, again, my brief time of serving at the U.S. mission to NATO, is that NATO is never going to ask or force any country, any member, to do any activity that it doesn't want to do. That's just the way it's set up. There may be suggestions and guidelines, but at the end of the day, it's 30 sovereign, hopefully someday 32, hopefully but someday very soon, 32 sovereign nations that have come together openly, voluntarily, willingly into an alliance of equals.
If I can just chime in here on the concept of the alliance of equals, because I think there's also a critical part that we have to take into account, and that membership is also an opportunity. And so though there is appropriately a significant debate here about what should be the future contributions, and of course, longstanding members are also having questions about, do they want to maintain their contributions? Do they want to adjust theirs? This is also a time where NATO is having to reconsider whether its posture is appropriate for current challenges and for projected. What does the threat environment look like over the next decade? What types of missions should be shouldered by different members, and how? And so regardless of the decision specifically about the F-35, there's a broader debate here about what contributions Finland might expect from other members, what they want to see the overall alliance look like, what are its priorities, and how to advocate specific concerns to ensure that they are voiced and to ensure that they are understood and met by the rest of the community as well.
Alex gave a great answer already on the sea-launched cruise missile nuclear, SLICM-N. Let me just add one thing, and again, it's going to be from the perspective of an airman. Some of you may recall that during the Kennedy administration, there was an analyst, an assistant secretary named Elaine Enthoven, who brought in the whole planning, programming, budgeting process, which the Department of Defense continues to use. And one of the process he instituted in there was in trying to answer the question, how much is enough, which was a title of a book he subsequently wrote, is to decide, first of all, what sort of capabilities, what sort of effects on the battlefield does the U.S. military want to be able to create? And by extension, what does the alliance want to create? And then what are the best means of achieving those effects? And sometimes these effects are substitutable. A short-range rocket launched from a naval surface ship might be able to have the same military operational effect as a bomb drop from a naval airplane. So the question then becomes, what kind of mixes do you want to have in order to achieve the overall effect and have the overall capability that you want to have? At the end of the day, there just are not enough dollars in any nation's budget to pay for every thing that might be nice to have and might be useful to have. for the short term, for the next 10 years or so, the United States is going to be fully engaged and fully focused on developing and producing the modernization programs that Alex so carefully and eloquently discussed. That's a huge job. And it is, coming from my background as the Undersecretary for Nuclear Security and head of the National Nuclear Security Administration, what we're doing already to do those programs and to develop and modernize the warheads that will go on these new systems that the Department of Defense is developing is already stressing the capacity of the enterprise to deliver on time and on budget. So I think we have to be very, very careful and very, very judicious in adding any additional work to the work that's already there. The Secretary of Defense, Lloyd Austin, has said, we already have the W-76-2 as a low yield option. We already have air-launched cruise missiles, and we're going to replace those with the LRSO, the long-range standoff capability, with a new warhead. The F-35 can carry the B-61-12, as can the Air Force's long-range bombers. So there are a host of options in terms of the size, scale, and scope of nuclear use, should God forbid that ever became necessary, and therefore a broad scope of capabilities which create deterrence by putting in the mind of a potential adversary the fact that the United States and the Allies have weapons in arrows in their quiver that they can use in a variety of scenarios.
And I think, the underlying concept that is in this op-ed, and I think in others that we should probably expect to see over the next few weeks that are questioning the decision about the Silicon Men, is the idea that the scale and pace of the Chinese buildup, the deterioration of U.S. relations with China, suggests that the U.S. needs to adjust sort of the scale of its own inventory. And what we see in the NPR is really a demonstration of the administration's confidence that it is able to meet current requirements and anticipated future requirements with what it has, and then what is coming down the line already. The key words that you see over and over and over in the NPR, this is true not just in the nuclear side, but also in the conventional, but I think particularly there is the concept of resiliency, flexibility, reliability, and redundancy. And so by cutting the system, the idea isn't just we have one other alternative. It's that we still are able to ensure all of those with a variety of delivery systems and sort of weapons in place already. And so these costs are not. There are, though, I think there's also a question about the political. I don't want to, speak for the administration. I did not have to make these decisions. Yes, the cancellation is popular with those that have been skeptical of the overall modernization program. The Silicon Men was itself a source of controversy because of concerns about whether where it would be deployed, what position this would put allies who did not want to have these weapons in their ports, and other sort of concerns. But I think it would be too much to say that this has then satisfied that wing. This is what they expected, what they wanted, but it's not necessarily enough. And so I don't think we can see this as entirely a political or even primarily a political decision. It's been pretty consistent from the Department of Defense. It's not needed. But I think underlying this, and I'm going to throw this back to Frank because I think it gets to some arms control questions. There was also the question about what conditions the U.S. might begin to consider increasing sort of its arsenal or diversifying in new realms. He'll be the one to be able to talk to that more specifically. But I do think still we have seen already this change in scale. We've seen this diversification. And the consistent line is that the U.S. does not need to match kind in kind because it is able to rely upon existing and anticipated strengths.
I'm happy to take that on, Villa, but I see we're at the magic hour.
Unfortunately, we are at the magic hour. I think we could have really gone on for another 30 or 40 minutes easily, maybe for the rest of the day. But unfortunately, we have indeed run out of time. I really want to thank Frank and Alexandra for taking the time to speak with us today. It's been an enlightening discussion. I also want to thank Leo for his expert questions and for guiding the discussion. It's a virtual setting. You won't hear the applause. I'm sure there is a lot of applause somewhere in the virtual space, but I really look forward to continuing these discussions in the future with both of you within different via settings and other settings as well. So thank you very much, everyone. We are adjourned for the day.
Thank you.
Thank you.